They said she was too fat to ever be loved, but in the dusty valley of Coyote Hollow, one cowboy proved them all wrong. When storms raged and the town turned its back, Jace Callahan saw not her size, but the strength of her heart. This is a story of courage, of defying cruel whispers, and of finding love where no one believed it could bloom. And what about you? Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let us know. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story that may just touch your soul. The summer of 1878 in Willow Creek, Texas pressed down like a heavy hand. The sky stretched wide and pitiless, a dome of hard blue broken only by the drifting haze of circling hawks. Heat rippled above the roofs of the town's wooden buildings, bending the outlines of the saloon, the general store, and the blacksmith's forge into wavering shapes. Dust rose in little whirlwinds whenever a wagon passed, clinging to boots and hems, working its way into the corners of eyes. Willow Creek was a place where stories spread faster than prairie fires, and reputation was worth more than coin. A girl could be praised into a wife, or whispered into ruin, and Amelia Hartwell knew too well which fate the town had chosen for her. Amelia, at 23, was not a fragile beauty in lace, but a young woman of substance. Her skin was pale, flushed easily when the sun touched it, and her hair, thick, the color of ripe wheat, was braided and pinned with stubborn determination each morning. Her figure was fuller, her hips wide, her arms soft, her face round with cheeks that dimpled when she laughed, though laughter had grown rare of late. What struck anyone who cared to look past appearances were her hazel eyes, alive with intelligence, and her voice, which held both gentleness and an undertone of quiet steel. But few looked beyond the surface. The town had branded her too fat to marry, and every suitor who once courted her had yielded to those whispers. The first rejection she had borne with dignity. The second left her wary. But the third, Thomas Darrow, had cut her to the bone. Thomas was tall, dark-haired, with eyes like polished coal. He had written her letters filled with vows of devotion, had spoken to her mother about their future, had walked her proudly into Sunday service. She had believed. Yet 2 weeks before their wedding, a letter came in his tidy script. It was brief, almost businesslike, announcing that he would wed another, one whose family held more land and whose waistline pleased society's eye. Amelia had read the words until they blurred, pressing the page against her chest as though the ink might reverse itself. That afternoon, she sat slumped on the porch of her family's small house at the edge of town, the crumpled letter in her hands. Her body shook with sobs that tore from her like a storm breaking through. The wooden planks beneath her creaked under her shifting weight, and she fancied even the boards judged her. Cicadas screamed from the oaks, relentless, and the sun hung merciless, burning every shadow away until nothing was hidden, not even her shame. From inside, Margaret Hartwell stepped softly onto the porch. Margaret was a woman in her late 50s, shoulders narrow, her frame so thin that her dresses hung loose. The years had carved lines across her face, but in her gray eyes lived a sharpness tempered by kindness. Her once black hair, now silver, was pulled back in a bun that revealed the strong bones of her face. Widowed when Amelia was a child, she had kept the homestead alive with stubborn grit, mending, trading, making preserves, and never once letting grief swallow her. She leaned against the doorframe, her hands weathered and veined, watching her daughter. "Amelia," she said quietly, "the more you clutch that paper, the deeper it will cut." Amelia lifted her face, streaked with tears, eyes red but burning with wounded disbelief. "Mama, why am I never enough? Each time I believe a man's words, each time I let myself hope, and each time they turn away. Do you know what they whisper about me in town? That I am a burden, that no man should be saddled with me." She crushed the letter in her fist, her voice breaking. Margaret moved closer, her thin hand resting firmly on her daughter's shoulder. They see only what is easy to see. Shallow eyes judge quickly. But I tell you, child, one day there will be someone who looks deeper. He will see the size of your heart, not the shape of your body. Amelia shook her head, bitter tears spilling. "I don't believe it." Margaret crouched, slow with age, until her eyes met Amelia's. "When I was your age, I was not considered a prize either. Too plain, too quiet, not enough to turn heads. Yet your father looked at me and said I was exactly what he had prayed for. We had 20 good years before fever took him, and I would not trade one of those days for all the town's approval. Remember that, Amelia. Men's gossip is smoke. It vanishes. True love, when it finds you, is fire. Before Amelia could answer, the sound of children's laughter drifted up the lane. A group of boys ran past, ragged from play, and one shouted in cruel mimicry, "Fat Amy! Fat Amy! No one will marry!" The others took up the chant, their voices high and mocking, until they vanished down the street in a cloud of dust. Amelia flinched as though struck, her fist tightening around the paper until it tore. She turned to her mother, her voice shaking but fierce. "I can't stay here, Mama. Every corner, every pew, every glance carries their scorn. If Willow Creek has decided I am nothing, then I must find a place where I can be something. I will not die inch by inch under their eyes." Margaret's lips pressed tight, torn between pride and fear. "The world outside is no softer, Amelia. Men can be crueler still. But I will not chain you to this porch. If you go, go with your head high." Amelia stood, her skirt swaying in the hot wind, her round face hardened into resolve. The letter slipped from her fingers onto the porch, but this time she did not let the breeze carry it. She bent, struck a match from her mother's box, and touched flame to the corner. The paper curled, blackened, words twisting into ash. She held it until the fire licked close to her hand, then dropped it to the ground, where it smoldered to nothing. For the first time since Thomas's betrayal, her tears ceased. She looked at the horizon where the sun bled into a wash of crimson. Her chest still ached, her heart still bore the weight of mockery, but something inside had shifted. "I will leave, Mama," she whispered. "I will build a life where gossip cannot reach me. And maybe, just maybe, I will find someone who sees me for who I am." Margaret's eyes filled, but she nodded, pride softening the grief etched into her features. "Then let this be your beginning, child." The wind stirred the last ashes of the letter, scattering them into the dusk. Somewhere beyond the hills, the world stretched wide with hardship and possibility. Amelia Hartwell did not yet know where her path would lead, but she had chosen to walk it. And though she could not sense it, fate was already shifting, preparing to place in her way a man who carried scars of his own, one whose eyes would one day hold her, as no words could. The ashes of the letter still lingered in Amelia's mind as she left Willow Creek behind. The following dawn had broken pale and sharp, with thin clouds drifting like torn cloth across the sky, and by the time the stagecoach carried her across the scrublands of northern Texas, the cicadas had yielded to the whistle of meadowlarks and the rattle of wagon wheels striking deep ruts. She pressed her face to the small window and watched the land stretch out, dry mesquite and prickly pear standing in lonely clusters, the red earth shimmering under the sun. Each mile felt like another layer of shame falling away, though her heart still beat heavy with uncertainty. The coach smelled of dust and horse leather, and she shared it with two passengers, a trader with his hat tipped low, smelling faintly of tobacco, who muttered about cattle drives when spoken to, and an older woman wrapped in a black shawl, her lined face turned toward the heavens in silent prayer. Amelia was grateful for the quiet. She clutched her stack of books on her lap, the corners fraying from years of handling, and thought of her mother's parting words. "True love is fire, gossip is smoke." She repeated the phrase like a prayer until the clamor of the wheels and the wide sky lulled her into a fragile calm. By late afternoon, the land gave way to a valley carved by a thin river lined with cottonwoods. There it lay, Coyote Hollow, a scattering of clapboard houses, a church steeple that leaned slightly against the horizon, and a schoolhouse whose white paint was already peeling under the merciless weather. Smoke curled from chimneys, voices rose and fell on the wind, and cattle dotted the pastures beyond. It was smaller than Willow Creek, poorer too, but Amelia felt something stir in her chest at the sight. Perhaps here, far from the whispers, she could prove herself more than a jest. The coach ground to a halt in front of the general store. Dust swirled around her skirts as she stepped down, gripping her trunk tightly. The heat pressed close, making her cheeks flush. At once she felt eyes on her, men leaning against the hitching posts, women shading their faces with bonnets, children clutching their mothers' skirts. Their looks carried the same unspoken questions she had grown used to. Who is she? What use is she? And why does she look as she does? Her chin lifted by instinct, though her stomach tightened. Among the watchers, one figure stood slightly apart near the watering trough, tall and broad-shouldered, his stance quiet but commanding. Jace Callahan was in his late 20s, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-browned arms corded with muscle, his dark trousers tucked into weathered boots. His chestnut hair, touched by streaks of sun-bleached gold, hung loosely around his brow until he pushed it back with one strong hand. His eyes, a piercing blue, studied everything with a calm intensity, giving little away. There was something guarded in the set of his jaw, a man, used to labor, solitude, and perhaps loss. By his side, tied to the post, stood his black stallion, Onyx, restless and stamping, tossing his head so that his long mane whipped against his muscled neck. The animal seemed barely contained, his coat shining like obsidian in the sun, his eyes sharp and distrustful of strangers. Beside Jace stood a girl of 11, her posture straight, but her hands gripping a primer book tightly against her chest. Lila Callahan, his niece, wore a simple cotton dress faded from washing, her dark hair braided neatly with a bit of ribbon that had once been blue. Her eyes, softer than her uncle's, still held a guarded curiosity. She had been raised by Jace since her mother's death 3 years before, and though she rarely spoke to strangers, she peered at Amelia with the cautious interest of a child, used to loss but still hungry for connection. Before Amelia could speak, a voice cut across the gathering. Reverend Eli Pratt, pastor of the Coyote Hollow Church, strode forward. He was a man in his 50s, lean and angular, his thinning gray hair hidden beneath a stiff black hat. His black coat seemed heavy in the heat, his mouth a thin line carved by years of sermons more stern than kind. His dark eyes swept over Amelia as though weighing her soul against a scale he alone carried. "You are Miss Hartwell?" he asked, his voice measured. "I am," Amelia answered, pressing her hands together, though she kept her chin lifted. "You've come about the school." "Yes, I studied in Denver, and I have taught before. I believe I can serve the children here." The Reverend's gaze narrowed. "The last 3 teachers left within months, isolation, illness, or lack of endurance. We cannot afford another failure. More than lessons are at stake. The teacher must be an example for the young." His eyes flicked, not kindly, over Amelia's figure. "Some will question whether you represent the discipline this valley requires." The words stung, but Amelia drew a breath, her voice steady. "Children learn most from patience, from fairness, and from kindness. That is the example I intend to give." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded, others exchanged doubtful looks. Amelia felt the weight of their judgment, but refused to let her gaze fall. Jace remained silent, his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. But those piercing eyes lingered on the Reverend a moment longer than on anyone else, and when Pratt's words hung heavy in the air, Jace shifted slightly, a subtle tightening of his jaw. He did not speak, yet the disapproval in his silence was enough to draw glances from the townsfolk. His reputation carried weight. People noticed when Jace Callahan disagreed, even without words. It was then Lila tugged lightly at his sleeve. She looked up at him, then across at Amelia, and in a small, clear voice said, "Uncle, she looks kind." The words, spoken without calculation, carried into the hush. Amelia's throat tightened, the sting of Pratt's disapproval suddenly eased by the innocence of a child. Pratt cleared his throat, his face stiff. "We will see," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking toward the church steps, his coat flapping behind him. A few townsfolk followed, still whispering, while others drifted back to their errands, leaving Amelia in the hot dust with her trunk at her feet. Onyx pawed the ground then, tossing his head and snorting as though sensing the tension. Jace moved to steady the reins, his hand calm against the restless beast. In that moment, Amelia found herself staring at horse and man together, both powerful, both self-contained, both radiating a strength that demanded respect. When Jace finally glanced at her, it was only a brief nod, acknowledgement, nothing more, before he swung into the saddle with the ease of long practice. Lila scrambled up behind him, still holding her book, and together they rode off, the stallion's hooves drumming against the baked earth. Dust rose in their wake, and the crowd melted away until Amelia stood alone in the fading heat. She bent to lift her trunk, her fingers trembling from more than its weight. The day had introduced her to doubt, to suspicion, to the familiar sting of judgment. Yet it had also given her something else, the memory of a child's trusting voice and the silent disapproval of a man who had not spoken but had seen. For Amelia, that was enough to take her first step toward the schoolhouse and whatever awaited her within its walls. The first days in Coyote Hollow passed in a haze of wary glances and murmured doubts. Yet Amelia walked each morning to the schoolhouse with her books held close as though they were a shield, her stride steady despite the weight of eyes upon her. The children came hesitantly at first, a dozen or so from the scattered homesteads and ranches. Little Sarah with her rag doll tucked beneath her arm, Daniel with a shock of blonde hair and a restless grin, Hannah and Ruth clinging to each other in nervous silence. Their parents lingered outside the first morning, whispering to one another, but curiosity overcame suspicion, and soon the benches filled with small bodies. Their faces turned toward Amelia's voice as she guided them through letters, numbers, and tales of explorers and heroes. She caught sight of Lila Callahan, too, slipping quietly into the back row, her braid tied with a strip of faded ribbon, her pale blue eyes fixed not on her slate, but on Amelia, cautious yet hungry to believe. By the end of the week, the weather shifted. Morning dawned thick and gray, the air heavy with that strange stillness that sets cattle to pacing in their pens and birds to vanishing from the sky. Amelia stood on the schoolhouse steps, shawl clutched at her throat, gazing westward at the bruised dark clouds rising over the hills. The air smelled of dust and rain, and beneath her feet, the earth seemed to hum with warning. When the children arrived, she tried to smile, guiding them into their seats, though she felt a tightness in her chest she could not ease. The hours dragged, the sky darkening, thunder muttering at first, then rolling louder, closer. The younger children grew restless, eyes darting to the windows, while the older ones whispered of roofs torn away and hailstones that had shattered windows last spring. Amelia urged them to keep at their work, though her own heart pounded as the wind pressed against the shutters and dust sifted through the cracks. By midday the storm arrived with full fury. The wind roared like a beast unleashed, rattling the timbers until the whole building groaned, and rain slashed sideways, battering the roof. A beam cracked overhead with a splintering sound, and shrieks filled the room as the children huddled together. Amelia's voice rose above the din, calm though her throat was raw. She directed the older boys to help push benches against the walls, ushered the little ones to crouch low, and braced her own body against the trembling door. The storm hammered without mercy, the roof threatening to tear away. Just as a shingle crashed to the floor and Hannah screamed, hoofbeats pounded outside, fast, heavy, unrelenting. The door burst open and Jace Callahan strode in, rain pouring from his shoulders, his dark hair plastered to his brow, his eyes blazing blue in the gloom. Behind him loomed Onyx, the black stallion rearing and snorting, fighting the wind and thunder, his muscles rippling as if the storm itself had challenged him. For a moment Amelia feared the beast would break free, but Jace's grip on the reins held steady, his deep voice cutting sharp and commanding. "Easy, boy, easy." Slowly Onyx settled, stamping but standing firm, a shadow of strength against the chaos. Jace's gaze swept the trembling children, then fixed on Amelia. His voice, rough but steady, cut through the storm. "This roof won't last. We have to move them to the church. Stone walls will hold." Amelia shook her head, shielding the little ones with her arms. "It's too dangerous to take them out in this." Another beam split with a deafening crack, dust and splinters raining down. Jace lunged forward, catching the sagging timber on his broad shoulder, holding it with a grunt that echoed through the room. For an instant he bore the weight of the storm itself, muscles straining, his jaw set like iron. "There's no choice," he growled. "We move, or this place buries us." She met his eyes, unyielding, fierce, and in that look found the truth. Nodding once, she turned to the children, her voice rising, firm and clear. "Take each other's hands, stay together, follow Mr. Callahan." The exodus began. Jace heaved the broken beam aside, then lifted Daniel, frozen with fear, into his arms, the boy clutching at his neck. Amelia gathered Hannah and Sarah close, pulling them through the doorway into the screaming wind. The rain lashed their faces, mud sucking at their boots, yet she moved with unshakable determination, her shawl whipping in tatters behind her. Jace strode ahead, shouting directions, his figure a wall of strength against the storm. Onyx proved himself more than beast. Though lightning split the sky above and thunder cracked like cannon fire, the stallion stood solid, sides heaving, his great head tossing but his hooves rooted. Jace boosted 2 children onto his back, the animal's ears flattening but his body steady, carrying them forward towards safety. Another child slipped in the mud, and Amelia dropped to her knees, hauling the girl upright, though her skirts were sodden, her breath ragged, her arms burning. Jace's hand closed over her shoulder, firm, steady, and together they lifted the child and pushed onward. At last, looming through the sheets of rain, the stone walls of the church appeared, its steeple bent but still standing, lantern light flickering from within. They stumbled through the doors one by one, drenched and gasping, collapsing onto the wooden pews. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, with Jace's weight braced against it, shutting out the howling wind. For a long moment the only sound was ragged breathing, children sobbing into Amelia's soaked skirts, her arms wrapped around them as if to convince herself they were all real and alive. Gradually calm returned. Daniel, still in Jace's arms, clung to his neck, his tears mixing with the rainwater on the cowboy's jaw. Jace set him down gently, his large hand ruffling the boy's hair before he turned to secure the latches. Amelia sank onto a pew, her braid undone, strands of honey-colored hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes red but burning with a strange brightness. She had never felt so exhausted, nor so fiercely alive. Then a small weight pressed against her side. Lila, her eyes wide and cheeks pale, slipped onto the bench beside her. She did not speak at first, only reached to grasp the edge of Amelia's damp sleeve. Amelia looked down, startled, and saw the girl's lip trembling. Carefully she set an arm around the thin shoulders, and Lila leaned into her, whispering, "You kept us safe." The words were quiet, uncertain, but they carried the raw truth of a child's heart. Amelia tightened her embrace, unable to answer for the lump rising in her throat. When she lifted her gaze, she found Jace across the room, his broad back bent as he tested the hinges of the window. He straightened then, turning to meet her eyes. For the first time, his guarded expression shifted, softened by something like respect. He studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly and spoke in a low voice meant for her ears alone. "You held them together, stronger than most I've seen." Heat flared in her cheeks, not from shame, but from something she had not felt in years, the recognition of her strength seen by another. She opened her mouth, but the words caught, and so she only nodded, holding Lila close as the storm raged on outside. The wind howled and the rain battered against the stone, but within the church the children calmed, their breaths evening out, their small voices murmuring thanks. And though Amelia's body trembled from fatigue, she knew something had changed, in Lila's trust pressed against her side, and in Jace Callahan's steady voice, stripped of doubt, carrying the weight of respect. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in Coyote Hollow. The valley smelled of damp earth and torn leaves. The cottonwoods bowed under the weight of the wind's fury, and the schoolhouse stood wounded, its roof scarred, its walls streaked with rain. No child had been lost, yet by the time the sun had returned, gratitude was already thinning, replaced by murmurs carried from porch to porch, hearth to hearth. Some said Amelia Hartwell had waited too long to move the children. Others whispered she had frozen in fear, and if not for Jace Callahan, tragedy would have struck. The truth of that night twisted into shadows, and Amelia found herself once more caught in the old snare of doubt and gossip. It was Martha Wilkes who gave the rumors shape. A widow in her 50s, with sharp eyes and lips always pursed as though savoring vinegar, she claimed she had seen Amelia trembling at the schoolhouse door while the storm tore at the roof. By the time her words reached the general store, her account had grown teeth, painting Amelia as unfit to lead, too fragile, too soft, too much a burden. And in a place like Coyote Hollow, where faith and reputation held a tighter grip than law, Such whispers spread like fire in prairie grass. On Sunday morning, the townsfolk gathered in the stone church that had protected them through the storm, the pews filled with ranchers in dust-stained coats, their wives in bonnets washed pale with lye. Children pressed between them, restless but subdued under the weight of expectation. The air was thick with the mingling of hymnals and unease. Reverend Eli Pratt stood at the pulpit, tall and austere, his black coat severe against the pale stone, his gray hair slicked neatly back. His gaunt face bore the lines of hardship, his hands gripping the lectern as though carved into it. Pratt had long believed that salvation lay in order, discipline, and purity of example, and his voice carried the certainty of a man who had never doubted his own convictions. Amelia sat near the back, her shawl drawn close against the draft, her hazel eyes lowered, though her back was straight. She felt the weight of stairs prickling against her skin. Beside her, Lila Callahan clutched her primer book, the blue ribbon in her braid, frayed but carefully tied, her small fingers creeping toward Amelia's sleeve, as though to draw quiet courage. At the front, Jace Callahan sat tall, his broad shoulders unyielding, his face carved in calm, but his blue eyes watchful, fixed on the preacher with an intensity that few dared to meet. Pratt cleared his throat and began, his voice firm, echoing against the stone walls. Brothers and sisters, the storm was a trial sent to remind us of our fragility. By God's mercy, every child was spared. But we must consider what it means to place our young in the hands of one who has not proven worthy. The school has faltered before, teachers come and gone, leaving our children adrift. Can we afford another failure? Should we entrust their minds and souls to one whose example may not lead them toward strength? His gaze swept the congregation, lingering on Amelia, though his words never named her. A murmur rose. Henry Maddox, a rancher in his 40s with sun-reddened skin and suspenders stretched across his chest, shifted uneasily in his seat. His wife clutched her kerchief, eyes darting. "The Reverend makes a point," Henry said at last, his voice carrying over the pews. "We've lost 3 teachers in as many years. If Miss Hartwell cannot endure, it's our children who pay the cost." Martha Wilkes seized her chance, her voice sharp. "I heard she froze when the roof split. If Mr. Callahan hadn't come, who knows what would have become of them? Do we want that kind of weakness before our children?" Her words cut deep, and Amelia's cheeks burned, though she pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. The silence stretched, brittle. Then a small voice broke it. "That isn't true." All heads turned. Lila had risen, her hands clutching her book so tightly the cover bent, her braid falling loose around her shoulder. Her voice shook at first, but she straightened, her eyes fixed on Pratt. "She kept us calm. She held us together when I was afraid." The simple words carried across the pews, thin but defiant, and for a moment the church was utterly still. Pratt's mouth tightened, disapproval etched into his thin face, but before he could speak again, the heavy sound of boots struck the wooden floor. Jace Callahan rose, removing his hat, his tall frame casting a long shadow down the aisle. He was a man known more for his silence than for speech, and when he spoke, people listened. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying, steady as the earth. His gaze swept the room, pinning each man and woman in turn. "I was there. When the roof split, it was Miss Hartwell who stood before your children. She gathered them when fear could have scattered them. She carried them when their legs gave out. She held them together until I came. You give me credit because I am a man broad enough to lift a beam, but it was she who gave them courage. Without her, no strength of mine could have saved them." His words fell heavy, like stones into water, rippling through the silence. Pratt opened his mouth, his voice taut with strain. "Mr. Callahan, no one doubts your standing, but—" Jace cut him off, his blue eyes blazing. "Then don't doubt hers. She has faced storm and trial, and she has proven her worth. My niece trusts her. I trust her. And if you have sense, you will too." Henry Maddox shifted again, this time nodding, his voice rough. "My boy Daniel says she held his hand through the dark. If she has the Callahan's word, she has mine." His wife glanced at him, then added softly, "Hannah won't stop saying Miss Hartwell kept her safe." Others began to murmur in agreement, heads nodding, doubt loosening its hold. Amelia sat frozen, her throat tight, until at last she found her voice. She rose slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her eyes sweeping the room. "I will not claim perfection," she said softly, but her words carried in the hush. "But I can tell you this. When Daniel wept, I held him. When Hannah nearly fell, I lifted her. I did not think of myself, only of them. That is what I promise, to put your children first, whatever storm comes. If that is not enough, then I do not belong. But if it is, then let me prove it day by day." Her words struck with a plainness stronger than eloquence. The silence that followed was not hostile now, but contemplative, and one by one, faces softened, nods spread, and whispers shifted into murmurs of support. Pratt closed his Bible with a snap, his authority shaken though not broken, and descended from the pulpit with a stiff bow of his head. As the congregation dispersed, Amelia felt a small hand slip into hers. Lila's grip was warm, her eyes bright with pride. Across the aisle, Jace replaced his hat, his gaze meeting Amelia's for a steady moment. There was no smile, no flourish, only respect, quiet, weighty, undeniable. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Amelia felt the tide had turned. The whispers had not vanished, but they no longer drowned her. She was not alone. The week after the Sunday service unfolded with a new stillness in Coyote Hollow. The sharp edge of whispers had dulled, though Amelia still caught the occasional glance that lingered too long, as if waiting for her to stumble. Yet more often she felt nods of recognition, small words of thanks from mothers whose children she had shielded during the storm, and the trust in Lila's gaze that did more to steady her than any sermon or vote of confidence. She moved through her days with a quiet resilience, guiding her lessons with renewed purpose, though in the evenings when the valley grew silent and the sky stretched wide, her thoughts strayed to Jace Callahan. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the ridges and the last of the children scattered toward home, Jace appeared at the schoolyard, astride Onyx. The stallion's black coat gleamed even in the fading light, his breath rising in steady plumes, his head held high with the restless dignity of untamed strength. Jace sat tall, his hat tipped back, his shirt sleeves rolled above forearms marked by the scars of rope and work. His face, usually unreadable, carried a flicker of something she could not place as he dismounted and crossed the yard, boots striking the earth with deliberate weight. He stopped a few paces from her, holding the reins in one hand. "Miss Hartwell," he began, his voice low, measured, as if he had rehearsed and yet still searched for words. "After all that's been said, maybe you and Lila could use some air. There's a place in the canyon where the stars come clear. I thought you might want to see it." Amelia's breath caught, her heart stumbling at the simple invitation. She looked instinctively at Lila, who had lingered near the doorway, her blue eyes brightening at once, her braids swinging as she rushed forward. "Please, Miss Hartwell," the girl pleaded softly, her voice alive with hope. Amelia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the stack of books in her arms, every instinct born of past rejection urging caution. But Lila's small hand slipped into hers, warm and insistent, and she felt her resolve soften. She looked back at Jace, his eyes steady, and inclined her head. "Very well," she said quietly. "If you're certain we won't intrude." They set out soon after. Jace led on Onyx, the stallion's strides long and sure, the horse tossing his mane when the evening breeze caught it, ears flicking to the sounds of night stirring in the brush. Amelia rode a smaller chestnut mare called Daisy, a gentle creature with a soft eye and a steady gait, the sort of horse that tolerated a nervous rider without complaint. Lila sat in front of Amelia, her small body leaning forward with excitement, her voice carrying back as she spoke of stars she had only glimpsed from the porch at night. Amelia wrapped an arm around the girl's waist, steadying her against the saddle, her own smile flickering as she listened. The ride took them west, the land, unfolding into open grassland before narrowing into a canyon carved by years of wind and water. Shadows stretched long, and the sky deepened to indigo, the first stars pricking through like tiny fires. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sage and damp stone, and every sound seemed to echo against the canyon walls. Lila gasped as the stars multiplied, her eyes wide with awe. "There are so many," she whispered. Amelia lowered her voice, brushing a hand against the child's shoulder. "They were always there, Lila. Sometimes it takes the darkest night for us to see what was waiting. They reached a clearing where the canyon opened into a wide basin, the ground blanketed in pale grass that shimmered under starlight, and the river winding silver at the base of the cliffs. Jace swung down from Onyx, moving with the ease of long practice, and lifted Lila carefully to the ground. Then he turned to Amelia, offering his hand. She hesitated a moment before placing her fingers in his palm, his warmth steady and sure as he lowered her gently from the saddle. For an instant, their hands lingered, his grip strong yet careful. And in the silence, she felt a current pass between them, unspoken yet undeniable. They spread a blanket near the riverbank, the horses tethered close. Onyx stamped once, tossing his head as though restless, before finally settling with a deep breath, his dark form blending into the shadows. Daisy grazed quietly, her ears flicking to the occasional cry of a night bird. Lila lay back on the blanket, pointing up at constellations, her voice bubbling with wonder as Amelia softly named them one by one. Orion's belt, Cassiopeia, the curve of the Great Bear. The girl's voice slowed, her lids drooping, until at last her breathing evened, her body curled beneath Amelia's shawl. The canyon fell into a hush, the night vast and still, the stars scattered above in dazzling brilliance. Amelia sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lifted. But she was aware of Jace beside her, his hat resting on his knee, his face turned toward the heavens, yet his gaze heavy with thought. He was silent for a long while, as though weighing each word, before finally speaking. "I wasn't sure I could raise her," he said, his voice roughened by memory. "When my sister passed, I thought Lila needed things I didn't have, softer hands, gentler words. I've done my best, but I've never been certain it was enough." Amelia turned toward him, her eyes softened by the honesty she heard. "You've given her love, Jace. A home, protection, a steady hand. That is more than many children ever know. She adores you. That is proof enough." He drew a long breath, the lines of his face etched in the moonlight. "Maybe, but I've watched her with you. She trusts you in a way I can't explain, and I see something return to her that I feared was gone. Safety. Joy. The sort of light a child should carry. And I've watched you stand against more than storms. You've stood against judgment, against doubt, and still held your ground." He paused, his hand flexing against his knee, his voice faltering as if unused to the weight of such words. "I'm no good with speeches, but I know what I've seen, and I know what I feel when you're near." Amelia's heart beat fast, her fingers twisting at the edge of her shawl. "You give me more credit than I deserve," she whispered, though her voice trembled with something more than modesty. He shook his head, his blue eyes holding hers with unflinching steadiness. "Number, I speak truth." He leaned closer, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual reserve. "I've tried to keep my distance. Loss makes a man cautious. But these weeks, I've found myself drawn to your strength, to the way you look at Lila, the way you see people when others only judge. I can't ignore it anymore." His hand moved slightly, brushing against hers, calloused fingers tentative, not commanding, as though offering rather than taking. She let her hand rest in his, her breath catching at the warmth and weight of his touch. For a long moment, neither spoke, the canyon holding the silence like a secret. "You don't have to answer now," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But know this, Amelia Hartwell. You're not alone here, not while I draw breath." Her throat tightened, her eyes blurring as she looked back at him, the starlight mirrored in his gaze. She did not trust herself to speak, so she only tightened her grip, letting her silence speak where words might falter. Above them, the stars blazed brighter, as though bearing witness, and beside them, the river carried its endless song. That night, under the weight of the canyon sky, Amelia knew something had shifted forever. No whispers could erase the trust of a child curled against her shawl, nor the honesty in the voice of the man beside her. For the first time since leaving Whispering Creek, she felt not judged, not measured, but seen. Winter laid its hand fully upon Coyote Hollow, the mountains white-shouldered against a pale sky, the roofs frosted, the breath of cattle rising like smoke over the ranches. Each day Amelia taught in the little schoolhouse, the stove burning bright, while children gathered in their coats and mittens, their voices rising in carols that echoed through the valley. She moved about with quiet purpose, her cheeks flushed with cold, her shawl drawn tight, but more and more, when she entered the general store or paused in the street, neighbors greeted her with nods, small smiles, even gifts of bread and apples. It was not one moment that changed their hearts, but many, for she had sewn costumes for the children's pageant, cooked side by side with Mrs. Maddox for the festival, and spent long afternoons teaching little Hannah Wilkes to read. Those who once whispered now spoke her name with gratitude. By the time December's end approached, the whole town stirred with preparations for the Christmas festival. Pine boughs were cut from the ridges, lanterns strung across the square, tables lined with pies, roast goose, and mugs of cider. Even Reverend Pratt, though still stern, allowed his congregation to dress the church with garlands. His sermons filled more with hymns than admonitions. The night of the festival arrived clear and sharp. Stars like ice scattered across the dark, and the hall glowed with candlelight that spilled through frosted windows, warming even the coldest hearts. Amelia walked into the hall with Lila's small hand in hers. The girl wore a blue wool dress trimmed with white lace, her braid tied with a ribbon Jace had bought on his last trip to Junction Creek. Lila's eyes shone as though she were seeing the world reborn. Amelia wore a gown of deep green, plain but well made, her honey-brown hair gathered in a loose knot, Margaret's old silver brooch clasping her shawl. As she crossed the threshold, she felt eyes turned toward her, and for the first time, the glances carried no cruelty, only welcome. Women greeted her warmly. Children rushed to tug her sleeve, and even Martha Wilkes pressed a pie into her hands with an awkward smile, murmuring, "For all you've done with the young ones." Amelia accepted, her heart swelling with relief and wonder. The evening unfolded with song and laughter. Children sang carols, their voices high and true, and Amelia's eyes blurred with tears as she saw Lila stand in the front row, no longer shy, but singing boldly, her voice clear above the rest. Applause shook the rafters, and Amelia found herself applauding harder than anyone, her chest filled with pride, not only for the girl, but for the place that had begun to feel like home. Afterward, fiddles struck up. Couples whirled across the floor, boots tapping against the boards, skirts flashing in the golden light. Amelia lingered at the edge, her hands clasped, until she saw Jace striding through the crowd. He wore a clean white shirt beneath a dark vest, his shoulders broad, his presence drawing eyes without effort. He stopped before her, blue gaze steady, and extended his hand. "Dance with me," he said simply. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the floor. At first her steps were uncertain, but his arm was strong and sure at her back, guiding her, steadying her. Laughter bubbled from her lips, unbidden, and she felt the warmth of neighbors' smiles on her, rather than their judgment. When the song slowed, Jace did not release her hand, but guided her gently out into the winter night. The square lay hushed, snowflakes drifting from the heavens, lanterns swinging gently in the breeze. Behind them, the hall echoed with music and cheer, but out here the world was quiet, vast, and silvered beneath the stars. Amelia drew her shawl tighter, her breath rising in clouds. Jace stood before her, his hat in his hand, his eyes reflecting the lantern light, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had never seen. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence pressed between them like a question. Then he spoke, his voice low, rough with emotion. "Amelia, I'm no man for speeches, but I know what I've seen. I've seen you stand against the storm when others faltered. I've seen you teach with patience and kindness, steady as a rock. I've seen the way Lila looks at you, like she's found something she lost. And I've felt it myself, a pull I can't turn aside." He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his calloused palm. His breath clouded in the cold as he took a step closer. "Back in Whispering Creek, they may have called you too much or too little. They were blind. Because when I look at you, I see a woman who is exactly right, exactly the right size for my arms." The words struck her like a bell tolling, washing through every wound, every cruel whisper of her past. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she let out a trembling laugh that caught in her throat. Jace drew her into his embrace, his arms strong, certain, wrapping around her not as one claiming a prize, but as a man finding his place of rest. She pressed her face against his chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heart, and for the first time, she felt not merely accepted, but chosen. From the doorway of the hall came a sound, soft but urgent. Lila had slipped outside, her cheeks flushed, her hands clutching her shawl. She looked up at Amelia with wide eyes. "Does this mean I'll have a mother now?" Her voice trembled, half with hope, half with disbelief. Amelia bent, tears still on her cheeks, and gathered the girl into her arms. "Yes, Lila," she whispered. "Yes, it does." The weeks that followed brimmed with preparations. Women sewed a gown of ivory muslin. Martha Wilkes herself, hemming the sleeves as if to mend past wrongs. Henry Maddox and other men raised a pine arch before the church, ribbons fluttering bright against the snow. Even Reverend Pratt, though still rigid, agreed to stand aside so a visiting minister from Junction Creek could perform the ceremony. The whole town buzzed with anticipation, as if Amelia's union with Jace symbolized a new season for them all. On the wedding morning, the sky was clear, the ground sparkling beneath a mantle of snow. Lila scattered pine boughs as she walked solemnly ahead, her eyes shining with a pride that made Amelia's heart ache with love. Amelia followed in her simple gown, Margaret's silver brooch gleaming at her throat, her hand steady despite the tremor of joy in her chest. Jace stood waiting beneath the arch, his frame tall and resolute, his blue eyes locked on her with a devotion that banished every shadow. The vows were spoken before the gathered town, the ring slid onto her finger, and when the minister declared them husband and wife, Jace bent and kissed her with a tenderness that drew cheers and tears alike. The celebration spilled into the square, music rising, cider flowing, laughter echoing through the valley. Amelia felt herself swept into an embrace not only by her husband, but by the entire community. Once doubtful, now rejoicing. In the years that followed, their home filled with the warmth of family. Lila grew tall and strong, her timid smile replaced by confidence, her voice carrying brightly in song. In time, twins were born, their cries mingling with laughter and the lowing of cattle. Evenings found Jace reading by the fire, Amelia sewing as children drowsed against her lap, the house alive with peace and belonging. And in quiet moments beneath the stars, Jace would draw her close and repeat the words that had undone a lifetime of doubt. She fit perfectly there, exactly where she was meant to be. In the story of Amelia, Jace, and little Lila, we see that love is never measured by appearance or by whispers of doubt, but by the strength God plants in our hearts. It is a reminder that His miracles often come quietly, in the form of courage to stand, kindness to endure, and the gift of being chosen just as we are. In our daily lives, we too can find His hand guiding us through storms, leading us toward people who see us with His eyes, not the world's judgment. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of love and redemption. May God bless you and your family today and always, and if you believe in the miracle of His love, write Amen in the comments below.